Hello everyone, and welcome to lecture number 3 on the structure of cells. This lecture corresponds with chapter number 4 in the textbook, and it is also covered by quiz number 2 and extra credit number 1. Before we start, I'd like you to take a look at these pictures. These are pictures which I have pulled from I believe it's lab number 2. These are pictures that you may find on the exam. So I want you to identify these pictures as a lipid, a sugar, a protein, or a nucleic acid. Number 1 is a protein. Proteins are the only one that have this repeating NCC, NCC, NCC pattern. And you remember from our last lecture that they also have these side chains of amino acids hanging down. These methionine, alanine, those sorts of things. And remember there are 20 different things that can go there in the green boxes. Number 2 here, this is a lipid. If you remember from the last lecture, these are phospholipids. They have a polar head that's hydrophilic, it likes water, and a hydrophobic tail that does not like water. That will come this will be important in this lecture. Number 3 is a sugar. Remember, the sugars are the one that have these little pentagons and hexagons that are filled in. And lastly, this is a nucleic acid. Nucleic acids have these 3 phosphates right here. Then they've got a sugar, and then they have these bases here. These are the A's, T's, C's, and G's you've heard about that are part of DNA. So now we can officially start lecture 3 on cells with one of my favorite and most bizarre pictures from your textbook. This is Anton von Leeuwenhoek looking through his microscope with a headless snake flying over his head, and it looks like we just interrupted him wrapping his Christmas presents. You can see the wrapping paper and ribbons there. Yeah, not really sure about this one. So, this lecture we're talking about cells. What is a cell anyway? A cell is the smallest unit that shows all the properties of life, meaning metabolism. It takes in compounds like sugars and proteins and lipids, and it uses them for energy. Growth, it gets bigger on its own, and reproduction, it can divide and make 2 cells. So how big are cells anyway? Well, this is the tip of a needle, and you see the orange stuff on it that looks like shag. Now this is a needle tip through look at under a scanning electron microscope. Let's zoom in and zoom in even more. Now we're on the side of that needle, and there are some bacteria cells. These cells are about 1 micrometer in diameter. These are very, very small things. So cells can be very, very small. There are not many cells that you can see with the naked eye. So Antoni von Leeuwenhoek, our friend from that very bizarre chapter opening picture, built one of the first microscopes. And here is a cartoon showing that microscope. It's a lot different from what we're used to. You put the sample on this spiky thing here and look at it through the lens. Now, through this microscope, he was able to observe moving things, which he called animalcules because they were little animals. And he found them in the tartar on his teeth, in rainwater, and that sort of thing. He concluded that these things must be alive. Robert Hooke came along a little bit after him. He came up with a much better microscope. This is the microscope here with the focusing knob. You put the specimen here, and then this whole elaborate thing is the light. So he observed cork, which is what you find in the end of your wine bottles before you open them, unless you're so cheap that you shop at Walmart. Sorry. The cheaper wines have things that are not cork on the end. Good wine has cork. So anyway, Robert Hooke observed cork under the microscope and saw in it tiny compartments. He named these compartments celluli. But so that's where we get our word for cells. So Robert Hooke basically named cells. However, he didn't realize that cells were alive. Now, the observations of von Leeuwenhoek and other early microbiologists led us to come up with something called cell theory. Cell theory is the theory of cells, and it has 4 parts. The first part states that every living organism consists of one or more cells. Number 2, the cell is the structure and functional unit of all organisms. A cell is the smallest unit of life, individually alive, even in a body. So when we talk later on in this lecture about the parts of the cell, please remember that those individual parts cannot survive on their own. You have to have a whole cell. And so far we haven't found anything truly alive that didn't consist of at least one cell. All cells come from the division of other existing cells. This means that cells don't spontaneously grow on their own. They have to come from something else. Also, cells contain hereditary material, which they then pass on to their offspring. Now, I'm going to do a little aside here for a moment and tell you a bit about the term theory. Now, we use the word theory when we're just talking to our friends, like, I have a theory that Timmy's going to break up with Sally, or I have a theory that blah, blah, blah. But a theory in science means something more. A theory is a hypothesis which starts out as an educated guess, but this hypothesis has undergone years of testing, in some cases centuries of testing. This hypothesis has been supported by all the evidence gathered to date. So many experiments have been done using this, and all the evidence supports it. This hypothesis helps us make predictions about other phenomena, and so the theory becomes as close to truth as scientists will venture. So a theory, yes, a theory can still be disproven, but most of the time what's happening isn't, we're not throwing away the theory, but we're revising it. So every few years you'll see a thing in the newspaper, theory of evolution disproven by new fossil. Well, they don't mean the whole theory of evolution. They mean we found a new fossil that doesn't fit into what we thought happened. So we're going to amend the theory and add this new fossil in. So here are some other examples of scientific theory. First is atomic theory. All substances are composed of atoms. Then we've got things like gravitation. That's a theory that what goes up must come down. We've never had someone throw a ball and have it go off into outer space. So we're pretty sure that gravity happens. So that's when scientists talk about theories, they're talking about something that has been proven, not something that has not been proven. So there are some parts that all cells have. The first part that all cells have are a plasma membrane, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. This separates the cell from the outside. So you've got the inside and the outside. Then there's an area in the cell where the DNA is kept. The DNA is very important. That's the genetic information of the cell. And then you have the cytoplasm. This is the goopy mix of water, sugar, ions, and proteins between the plasma membrane and the DNA area. It's what's inside the cell. So here's that illustration from the very beginning of our lecture today. Here is the phospholipid. Here's a cartoon of that. This is this area here, the head, and then there's the two tails. And remember from the last lecture, if you put phospholipids in water, I mean, I'm not even talking about cells here. I'm just talking about you make these in a lab, you dump them in a beaker full of water. They will spontaneously form this two-layer membrane, where you have two layers where they're standing head out with their tails in the center. So you have the water-rich outside of the cell, you have the cytoplasm is down here, and then in here is a little area in between. Also, if you put enough of them in a beaker, not only will they form a bilayer, but they'll also form a circle. I guess as a sphere, three-dimensional one. That is the form that is puts the most surface area out towards the water. So it's a spontaneous thing. This is why most cells wind up being circles. So most single-celled organisms are so small that you need a microscope to see them. Now, why is that? Well, all the oxygen, food, and other good stuff that has to get into a cell has to cross the cell membrane. And all the carbon dioxide, waste, and other bad stuff have to leave through the cell membrane. So, if you have a cell the size of a basketball, think about the part of the cell that's in the very center of the basketball. That's a pretty long ways for food and water to go. And this has to do with something called the surface to volume ratio. If you have a very small circle, or a very small sphere like this guy, diameter is 2 centimeters, so it's 2 centimeters across. The surface area, so the area of the outside, it'd be the peel of the orange. That would be about 12.6 centimeters. And the volume is about 4.2. So you've got 3 times as much surface area as you have volume. But as you get bigger, the volume catches up faster than the surface area does. So by the time you've got a 6 centimeter diameter sphere, you end up with a 1-to-1 surface ratio. So the surface area is the same as the volume. And that's why this won't work. It takes too long for something in the middle of the cell to get to the outside. So how does this work? Well, most cells, sorry, I keep bumping the camera. Most cells are just very small, like the paramecium. But you do have some cells that are bigger, and they come up with ways of cheating the surface area to volume ratio. This picture here is on the inside of someone's small intestine. Not sure whose, I know it wasn't mine. You'll see these little finger-like projections here. What they do is they increase the surface area of the cell, because now the cell has these little hairy bits on top. Another thing that can happen is, like, the nerve cell is long, ropey, and kind of flat. Since it's so long and has so many protrusions, it cheats the surface area to volume ratio. Up here, you have some frog eggs. Each of these are individual cells, but the reason why they can exist like this is that they're not very metabolically active. All the frog embryos are doing is dividing and developing. It's not like they're running a marathon in there. So they're not requiring much oxygen or giving off much carbon dioxide.